The Berlin Airlift was not simply a rescue mission. It was a decision to answer Stalin's first great Cold War test with schedules, coal sacks, radar, and nerve instead of tanks. That is what made Berlin so dangerous. The city was not on the edge of the Soviet world. It was inside it. The western sectors of Berlin were an island of American, British, and French authority surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. Every road, every rail line, every canal or river route that connected West Berlin to the western zones had to cross territory controlled by the Soviet Union. So when Soviet forces cut those routes on June 24, 1948, the question was not abstract. It was immediate and brutal. Could aircraft alone keep a modern city alive long enough to prove the West would not be pushed out? The contradiction had been built into the peace after the Second World War. Defeated Germany was divided into occupation zones administered by the victorious powers. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union each held authority over a zone. Berlin, the former capital of Nazi Germany, received its own special treatment. Though it lay deep inside the Soviet zone, the city itself was divided into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. On a map, that arrangement looked like a compromise. In practice, it was a trap waiting for a crisis. West Berlin was not a country. It was not even physically attached to the Western occupation zones. It was a set of Western-held urban districts surrounded by the power most determined to shape post-war Eastern Europe in its own image. The American sector, the British sector, and the French sector were political commitments drawn through streets, neighborhoods, railway yards, power grids, and ruined housing blocks. They were proof that the Western Allies still had a place in the old German capital. But they were also exposed in a way no army planner could ignore. That exposure mattered because Berlin was more than geography. It was a symbol of who would determine the future of Germany, and by extension, the future balance of Europe. If the Western Allies could be forced out of Berlin without a direct battle, the message would travel far beyond the city. It would suggest that agreements made at the end of the war could be reversed by pressure. It would show that a major European city could be isolated until political will broke. And it would raise a question every capital in Europe would understand. If Berlin could be abandoned, what else might be abandoned? The Soviet position had its own logic. From Moscow's point of view, Berlin sat within the Soviet occupation zone, and the Western presence there was an anomaly. The Western Allies had legal and political rights in their sectors, but their supply lines depended on passage through Soviet-controlled territory. That created a pressure point. Berlin could be squeezed without immediately firing on American, British, or French troops. A blockade could be framed as an administrative measure, a transport dispute, a response to Western policy. But its effect would be unmistakable. It would test whether the Western Allies were prepared to sustain a city they could not reach by land without Soviet cooperation. The city itself had already endured catastrophe. Berlin after the war was damaged, crowded, short of necessities, and politically divided. Food, fuel, medicine, and electricity were not luxuries, they were the terms of survival. Coal mattered as much as bread, because coal meant heat, power, and the ability to keep basic urban life functioning. A city could not live on speeches. It needed calories. It needed hospital supplies. It needed machinery, soap, newspapers, and fuel. It needed a daily flow of material things. That daily flow was the vulnerable part. Surface access connected West Berlin to the western zones of Germany by rail, road, and water. Those routes carried the weight that aircraft normally could not, the heavy, steady tonnage of a city's existence. Before the crisis, no one would have designed Berlin's survival around cargo planes. Air transport was useful, but it was expensive, weather-sensitive, and limited by aircraft capacity, runway conditions, traffic control, and maintenance. To imagine supplying a city by air was to imagine turning emergency aviation into an industrial system. And yet the geography of Berlin made that possibility the only alternative short of retreat or direct confrontation. The Western Allies did have one crucial opening: agreed air corridors into Berlin. Those corridors would later become the narrow lifeline of the airlift, running from Frankfurt to Berlin, from Buckeberg to Berlin, and from Hamburg to Berlin. Each corridor was 20 English miles wide, about 32 kilometers. They connected the western zones to the Berlin Control Zone, the defined airspace around the city. On paper, these corridors were technical arrangements. In a blockade, they became something much larger, proof that access to Berlin was not only a matter of roads and rails. Still, the existence of corridors did not answer the central question. A legal route through the air was one thing. Feeding and fueling West Berlin through that route was another. The difference between the two was measured in tons, weather reports, engine hours, runway repairs, and the discipline of crews flying into a city under political siege. That is why the Berlin crisis became the first major test of the Cold War, not because armies clashed, but because they did not. The danger lay in the space between war and surrender. If the Western Allies tried to force armed convoys through Soviet-controlled territory, the confrontation could escalate rapidly. If they withdrew from Berlin, the political loss would be immense. The airlift offered a third path: resist the blockade without breaking it by force on the ground. But that third path depended on a gamble. It assumed that cargo aircraft could do what railroads, trucks, and barges had done. It assumed that pilots could fly with enough regularity to make supply predictable. It assumed that airfields inside West Berlin could absorb the traffic. It assumed that civilians could endure shortages while the system grew. And it assumed that Stalin would not choose to turn an air corridor into a battlefield plaza. In that sense, West Berlin's weakness became its power. Because the city was so obviously exposed, abandoning it would be visible to the world. Because it was surrounded, sustaining it would be equally visible. Every aircraft that landed at Tempelhof in the American sector or Gatow in the British sector would become more than a delivery. It would be a message. The Western Allies were still there. The symbolism was sharpened by the city's division. In one Berlin, four powers faced one another at close range. Streets and institutions carried the consequences of wartime alliance, turning into post-war suspicion. The Soviet sector stood beside the American, British, and French sectors, not across an ocean or beyond a distant frontier, but within the same urban body. Berlin made the Cold War intimate. It brought the abstract conflict over Germany into the daily life of a trapped population. This is the central contradiction that explains everything that followed. West Berlin was both indefensible in the traditional sense and impossible to surrender without consequence. It was vulnerable because it depended on access controlled by its adversary. It was politically explosive because its survival represented Western credibility at the exact point where Soviet pressure was most direct. The blockade did not come out of nowhere. It followed escalating disputes over occupation policy, Western plans for a West German state, and the introduction of a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in the Western zones and West Berlin. Those arguments turned Reconstruction into a contest for power. Money, administration, and supply routes became instruments of strategy. By the time the roads, rails, and waterways were cut, Berlin had already become a test case. The city's geography made the test possible. Its symbolism made the test unavoidable. And the answer would depend on whether the Western Allies could transform the air above Soviet-controlled Germany into a lifeline strong enough to hold. The city's geography made Berlin vulnerable, but geography alone did not close the roads. The blockade grew out of a political argument that had been tightening since the end of the war. What kind of Germany would emerge from the ruins? Who would control its recovery? And whether the Western powers would accept a permanently weakened occupation system that left Berlin exposed. At first, the occupation of Germany had been designed as a shared arrangement. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union each held zones of occupation, and Berlin, though located inside the Soviet zone, was divided into 4 sectors. In theory, this structure preserved Allied cooperation after the defeat of Nazi Germany. In practice, it placed 2 incompatible visions side by side. For the Western Allies, Reconstruction increasingly meant restoring enough economic life for Germany to function again. Food, fuel, industry, transport, banking, and government administration were not just domestic questions. They were the foundation of stability in Western Europe. A broken Germany could remain hungry, unstable, and dependent. A recovering Germany could become part of a larger political and economic order aligned with the West. For the Soviet Union, that same recovery looked dangerous. A stronger Western Germany might become a barrier against Soviet influence. A Western-backed German state might turn the temporary occupation zones into the first hard border of the Cold War. And Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, made the problem sharper. If the western sectors of the city were supplied, funded, and governed as part of the Western project, then a Western political presence would remain planted inside the Soviet zone itself. This was the road to the blockade, not a single quarrel, but a chain of decisions in which administration became strategy. The Western Allies moved toward combining their occupation policies and planning for a West German state. That development mattered because it suggested that Germany would not be kept as one jointly managed occupation space under equal Allied agreement. Instead, the Western zones were beginning to acquire a separate political future. The Soviet Union saw this not as neutral reconstruction, but as consolidation. The Western powers were not merely repairing roads and factories. They were building institutions. Berlin made every one of these choices visible. The city was not just another place affected by occupation policy. It was the point where the four powers still confronted one another daily. Every dispute over transport, food, currency, policing, and authority had a local meaning and an international meaning at the same time. A regulation in Berlin could become a statement about the future of Europe. By 1948, money became one of the central instruments of power. That may sound less dramatic than a tank column or a military ultimatum, but in post-war Germany, currency was a basic condition of survival. A functioning currency shaped wages, prices, trade, taxes, savings, and rationing. It determined whether reconstruction could be organized with confidence, or whether economic life would remain trapped in shortage and uncertainty. The Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, in the Western zones. This was more than a technical reform. It was a signal that the Western zones were being reorganized around a different economic system and a different political future. The Deutsche Mark promised a cleaner foundation for recovery in the West. It also marked a dividing line. Currency now expressed sovereignty before formal sovereignty existed. The dispute became even more explosive when the new Deutsche Mark was introduced in West Berlin. Berlin was still a divided city inside the Soviet zone, and the Soviet authorities rejected the idea that the Western sectors could simply be tied to the Western zones through money. To the Western Allies, currency reform in West Berlin was necessary because the city's Western sectors could not be cut off economically from the people and supply systems that supported them. To the Soviet Union, it looked like the Western powers were extending their new German order into the heart of the Soviet sphere. That was the contradiction of Berlin, made practical. If West Berlin used the new currency, then it was not just symbolically Western. It was financially connected to the West. Its shops, workers, administrators, and supply networks were being pulled into the same orbit as the Western occupation zones. Monetary policy became a way to define belonging. In a ruined city, money was not abstract. It affected the price of bread, the movement of coal, the payment of labor, and the credibility of local administration. A currency that people trusted could support reconstruction. A currency dispute could paralyze it. That is why the argument over the Deutschmark carried so much weight. It touched ordinary life, but it also touched the balance of power between the occupation authorities. The Soviet response did not come in isolation. It followed the larger pattern of escalating conflict over occupation policy and the Western plan for a West German state. From Moscow's perspective, the Western Allies were changing the meaning of the occupation without Soviet consent. They were treating their zones not as temporary administrative districts within a jointly controlled Germany, but as the foundation of a new political entity. West Berlin, because of its location, became the place where that transformation could be challenged most directly. The surface routes into the city were the pressure points. Rail lines, roads, and waterways connected West Berlin to the Western zones across territory controlled by the Soviet Union. As long as those routes remained open, the Western sectors could survive as an exposed outpost. But if those routes were cut, the weakness of West Berlin's position would become immediate. Its people needed food, fuel, medicine, and daily necessities. Its power and heat depended on supply. Its political survival depended on the ability of the Western Allies to keep their promise in material form. This is where reconstruction became coercion. The same systems needed to rebuild Germany could be used to squeeze Berlin. Currency could define control. Administrative authority could define legitimacy. Transport routes could become weapons. The blockade was not simply a military act. It was the use of post-war infrastructure as political force. The Western Allies faced a harsh reality. Their position in Berlin rested on agreements and on presence, but the city's land access depended on routes through Soviet-controlled Germany. The Soviet leadership did not need to invade the western sectors to test them. It could make the city harder to feed, harder to heat, and harder to govern. It could force the Western powers to choose between accepting Soviet pressure, risking a direct confrontation on the ground, or finding some other way to keep Berlin alive. That choice was approaching by the hour in June of 1948. The introduction of the Deutschmark in the Western zones and West Berlin had turned the political division of Germany into something people could hold in their hands. It made the emerging split visible in pockets, pay envelopes, shop counters, and municipal accounts. For the Soviet Union, it was an unacceptable extension of Western policy into Berlin. For the Western Allies, backing away would have meant allowing pressure on the city to decide the future of post-war Germany. The conflict had narrowed to access. The roads, rails, and waterways were no longer just supply routes. They were the test of whether the Western presence in Berlin could be sustained when Soviet power pressed against it. By late June, the machinery of pressure was ready. The city remained where it had always been, surrounded by the Soviet zone, divided among the victorious powers and dependent on lines that could be severed. Then, on June 24, 1948, the crisis stopped being a warning and became a blockade. The blockade did not arrive as a single dramatic explosion. It arrived as a set of closures, orders, interruptions, and explanations that all pointed in the same direction. On June 24, 1948, the pressure that had been building around Berlin became physical. Soviet forces cut the rail, road, and water access that connected the western sectors of the city to the occupation zones of the United States, Britain, and France. For West Berlin, this was the geography of the crisis made real. The city had always been exposed, but exposure was different from isolation. Until that day, food, coal, industrial supplies, and ordinary necessities could still reach the western sectors by surface routes through Soviet-controlled territory. Those routes were never simple. They depended on arrangements among powers that no longer trusted one another. But they existed. They made it possible for the American, British, and French presence in Berlin to function. When they were cut, the western sectors became an island in more than a political sense. They were now a city of civilians, occupation officials, soldiers, hospitals, power needs, municipal services, and fragile post-war routines, surrounded by territory controlled by the same power applying the pressure. Berlin was not merely inconvenient to supply. It was dependent on supply. It needed food to keep people alive, coal to produce heat and electricity, medicine for clinics and hospitals, and materials to keep the city's damaged systems from failing further. The Soviet move was designed to expose that dependence. If surface access could be severed, then the Western presence in Berlin could be made to look unsustainable. The Western Allies would have to decide whether Berlin was worth the cost of staying. And that question was dangerous because every available answer carried risk. One answer was retreat. The United States, Britain, and France could accept that Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was too vulnerable to hold. They could withdraw from their sectors or reduce their claims until the city no longer stood as a Western outpost in the middle of Soviet-controlled Germany. In practical terms, retreat would have relieved the immediate pressure. It would have avoided a confrontation over roads and rails. It would have spared the Western powers the burden of feeding and fueling an isolated city. But retreat would also have sent a message far beyond Berlin. It would have suggested that Soviet pressure could push the Western Allies out of a major post-war European city without a battle. It would have weakened confidence in Western commitments at the very beginning of the Cold War. And it would have left the people of West Berlin to face the consequences of a political struggle they had not chosen but could not escape. The second answer was escalation. The Western Allies could try to force their way through by land, using armed convoys on the roads or rails that had been blocked. This had the appeal of directness. The surface routes had carried the city's lifelines before. Why not insist on using them again? But that directness was precisely the danger. Any attempt to push through Soviet-controlled territory risked turning a blockade into a shooting war between former wartime allies now facing each other as rivals. The crisis, therefore, had a peculiar shape. Berlin was too important to abandon easily, but too dangerous to rescue by force. The Western powers had soldiers in the city, but not a land bridge they could control. They had legal and political claims, but the routes on the ground were vulnerable to Soviet obstruction. They had a commitment to Berlin, but no obvious way to sustain that commitment without either surrendering it or gambling with war. That left the air. The air was not an afterthought, but it had not yet been proven as a solution on the scale Berlin required. The Western Allies had agreed air corridors into the city, Frankfurt to Berlin, Buckeberg to Berlin, and Hamburg to Berlin. These corridors mattered because they offered a path that was different from the blocked roads, rails, and waterways. They were narrow, regulated spaces above Soviet-controlled Germany, but they were spaces the Western Allies could use. If surface access was the instrument of Soviet pressure, the corridors offered a way to test whether that pressure could be bypassed without forcing a ground confrontation. At first, the idea of supplying a city by air could sound almost symbolic. Aircraft could bring in emergency cargo, officials, mail, or limited relief. But West Berlin did not need a symbol. It needed mass. It needed daily tonnage. Coal was as important as flour because electricity and heat depended on it. Food mattered not as a gesture, but as a continuing requirement. Fuel, medicine, machinery, and municipal supplies were not luxuries. They were the difference between a city under pressure and a city being slowly strangled. The problem was scale. A city could not survive indefinitely on occasional flights. A meaningful air supply operation would have to become repetitive, disciplined, and industrial. Aircraft would need to leave Western Germany, enter the corridors, land in Berlin, unload quickly, and return for more. Airfields in West Berlin would need to absorb constant traffic. Cargo would have to be measured not only by what a single plane could carry, but by what a system could deliver day after day. On June 24, that system did not yet exist. What existed was the crisis that demanded it. The blockade forced the Western Allies to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their political position in Berlin depended on logistics. Speeches, agreements, and flags could not feed a population or heat apartments in winter. If Berlin was to be held, it had to be supplied. If it could not be supplied, then the Western commitment would become hollow. The Soviet calculation rested on that pressure. By cutting rail, road, and water access, Soviet authorities could make Berlin costly without firing on Allied troops. The blockade was coercion below the level of open war. It created suffering and uncertainty, but it also placed the burden of the next move on the Western powers. If the West withdrew, Soviet pressure had succeeded. If the West forced the roads, the risk of military escalation could be blamed on the attempt to break through. If the West tried to fly, it would have to prove that aircraft could do what trains, trucks, and barges had done. This was why June 24 became more than a date in the administration of occupied Germany. It was the moment when the Cold War's first Great Berlin test became concrete. The dispute over currency and occupation policy had narrowed into a question that could be counted in tons, flight schedules, and stocks of coal. West Berlin's survival would no longer depend only on diplomatic language. It would depend on whether the Western Allies could move enough cargo through the air to keep an isolated city alive. The people in the western sectors understood the stakes in immediate terms. Their city had already endured war, destruction, hunger, and occupation. Now the blockade threatened to turn daily life into a new form of siege. The Western occupation authorities understood the stakes in strategic terms. Berlin was not only a place on a map. It was a test of whether the post-war settlement could be changed by pressure alone. And in Washington, in the American Occupation Command, and among the air commanders responsible for the practical response, the same hard choices were beginning to concentrate around a single possibility. The city could not be abandoned without consequence. The roads could not be forced without grave danger. The remaining path ran through the air corridors into Berlin, where cargo planes would have to carry not only food and fuel, but the credibility of the Western position itself. The path through the air corridors was not the easiest answer. It was simply the one that did not require surrendering Berlin or sending armed convoys into a direct collision with Soviet forces. In the first hours of the blockade, that distinction mattered. The Western Allies were not choosing between danger and safety. Every choice was dangerous. The question was, which danger could be controlled? For President Harry S. Truman, the crisis arrived as a test of American commitment in Europe at a moment when the shape of the post-war world was still being decided. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, but the western sectors were not a minor outpost. They were a visible claim that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France would remain present in the defeated German capital. If those sectors were abandoned after Soviet pressure on the roads, rails, and waterways, the result would reach far beyond the city. It would suggest that access could be cut, agreements could be bent, and the Western position in Central Europe could be pushed back without a battle. Truman's decision was therefore political before it was logistical. The United States would not simply leave, but the president also faced the danger of turning the blockade into a shooting war. Forcing a ground convoy through Soviet-controlled territory could have created exactly the kind of confrontation that no responsible leader could treat lightly. The blockade had been built around surface access. A ground answer would meet Soviet power at the point of pressure. An air answer would use the one remaining space where the Western Allies had an agreed route into the city. That is where the legal and practical meaning of the air corridors became central. The 3 air corridors into Berlin had been established as agreed routes: Frankfurt to Berlin, Buchenberg to Berlin, and Hamburg to Berlin. Each corridor was 20 English miles wide, about 32 kilometers. Around Berlin itself, the Berlin Control Zone extended within a 20-mile radius of the Allied Control Authority building and up to 10,000 feet. These were not abstract lines on staff maps. Once the blockade began, they became the narrow channels through which a city might survive. In Germany, General Lucius D. Clay carried the weight of the crisis from the occupation command. Clay understood Berlin not only as a logistical problem, but as a political signal. The western sectors were surrounded, dependent, and vulnerable, yet they were also the most visible proof that the Western Allies still had rights in the capital. To give them up under pressure would change the meaning of the occupation itself. It would tell Berliners, Germans, and the Soviet Union that the Western presence could be removed by isolation. Clay's position was firm because the alternatives were so bleak. There was retreat, which would spare an immediate confrontation, but carry a heavy strategic cost. There was a ground challenge, which might preserve access but risk a direct armed clash. And there was the airlift, which had never before been attempted on the scale Berlin required. It was a third course: resistance without tanks, resolve without an immediate battlefield. It did not promise success. It promised only that the Western Allies would try to turn aviation into supply and supply into policy. That choice depended on air commanders who could think in tonnage, routes, airfields, crews, and weather. Lieutenant General Curtis E. LeMay was one of the key American figures connected to the practical response. As an air commander, he belonged to the part of the decision that had to translate political resolve into aircraft movements. Berlin did not need a single dramatic flight. It needed food, fuel, and medicine day after day. It needed coal for heat, electricity, and basic urban life. It needed an air bridge strong enough to replace the surface routes that had been cut. The early question was whether such an air bridge could be more than a gesture. A few aircraft could make headlines. They could show concern. But West Berlin required sustained supply. The western sectors contained a civilian population that had already endured the destruction of war and the hardship of occupation. Their needs were not symbolic. They were measured in calories, tons of coal, medical supplies, and the steady movement of daily necessities. If aircraft were to hold Berlin, they would have to do the work of trains, trucks, and barges. The United Kingdom faced the same essential dilemma. British authorities controlled their sector of Berlin and the airfield at Gatow, just as the United States had Tempelhof in the American sector. The blockade threatened both positions. Like the Americans, the British had to decide whether to accept Soviet pressure, attempt to break it on the ground, or supply the city from the air. The British choice to join the air effort would become crucial because Berlin's survival could not rest on one runway, one fleet, or one national promise alone. The airlift solution had a strange character. It was bold, but it was also restrained. It challenged the blockade by refusing to accept its intended result, yet it avoided the most explosive form of confrontation. Cargo aircraft would not smash through roadblocks. They would fly through corridors whose existence the Western Allies could point to as an agreed mechanism of access. In that sense, the airlift was both a logistical answer and a diplomatic argument. It said that the blockade would not force the Western Allies out, and that the response would stay within a framework that made Soviet escalation harder to justify. This was the quiet power of the decision to fly. It denied Moscow the simple choice it may have expected to impose: leave Berlin or risk war on the roads. Instead, the Western Allies shifted the contest into a field where endurance, organization, and industrial capacity could matter. The question became whether aircraft could land often enough, carry enough, and keep moving despite weather, fatigue, mechanical strain, and the limits of Berlin's airfields. At the beginning, there was no guarantee that they could. The early American effort would have to rely first on available aircraft, including the Douglas C-47, before the larger Douglas C-54 Skymaster became central. The British would bring their own aircraft and procedures into a parallel operation. Tempelhof and Gatow would become lifelines almost immediately, and later the need for more capacity would help drive the construction of Tegel in the French sector. But all of that lay ahead. Before there were routines, records, radar discipline, or vast coal deliveries, there had to be a decision. That decision joined Truman's political responsibility, Clay's refusal to yield Berlin under pressure, and LeMay's role in turning air power toward a sustained supply mission. It also joined American and British purpose at a moment when the blockade was designed to isolate the Western sectors and test whether the alliance would hold. By choosing the air, the Western Allies accepted a burden that would grow larger with every day the blockade continued. The first flights would not solve the crisis. They would begin it in a new form. On June 26, 1948, the American operation would take shape under the name Operation Vittles. 2 days later, the British effort would follow as Operation Plainfare. What had been a strategic decision now had to become a daily movement of food, fuel, medicine, machinery, and the necessities of urban survival into a city that could no longer be reached by road, rail, or water. The decision to fly was only the beginning. Once Washington, the American command in Germany, and the British government accepted that Berlin would be supplied from the air, the crisis changed shape. It was no longer only a question of resolve. It became a question of weight, distance, weather, aircraft, unloading crews, fuel consumption, and the daily needs of a city that had been cut away from its normal life. On June 26, 1948, 2 days after the blockade closed the surface routes, the American response began under a name that sounded almost deliberately plain: Operation Vittles. The name carried the basic purpose of the mission. This was not a bombing campaign, not a show of force in the usual military sense, and not an evacuation. It was an attempt to keep a modern city alive by air, one load at a time. The first task was simple to describe and extremely difficult to perform. Food had to be moved from Western Germany into West Berlin. Fuel had to be moved as well, because survival in Berlin meant more than calories. It meant heat, electricity, cooking, transport, hospitals, water systems, and the limited industrial work that still tied the city together. Medicine had to be carried in. So did machinery, spare parts, soap, newspapers, and the ordinary supplies that made daily life possible. In the language of logistics, these were cargo categories. In the life of the city, they were the difference between endurance and collapse. The British effort followed 2 days after the American start. It was called Operation Plainfare. Like Operation Vittles, the name was modest, almost understated. But together, the two operations marked a dramatic turn in the blockade. The Soviet pressure had been aimed at the surface routes, rail lines, roads, and waterways. The Western answer was to shift the contest upward into the airspace that still connected the occupation zones with Berlin. That shift mattered because it allowed the Western Allies to resist without sending armed convoys through Soviet-controlled territory. A ground convoy could have forced the question of military confrontation immediately. An airlift did something different. It used the access that remained, avoided a direct ground collision, and placed the burden of escalation back onto the Soviet side. If Soviet forces chose not to shoot down the cargo aircraft, then the planes could keep coming. If they did shoot, the crisis would become something far more dangerous. In that narrow space between surrender and war, Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare began to operate. At first, the scale of the challenge could hardly be separated from the improvisation of the response. Aircraft that had been built and used for war were now being asked to perform an industrial act of relief. Each flight had to carry a load useful enough to matter. Each arrival had to be unloaded quickly enough to make room for the next. Each departure from Western Germany had to be part of a larger rhythm, because one successful flight did not feed Berlin. 100 successful flights did not solve the problem either. The city needed a continuing flow. The early American airlift relied on Douglas C-47 aircraft, a familiar workhorse of the Second World War. The C-47 could carry supplies into Berlin, and in the first days that mattered. But the aircraft also revealed the scale of the problem. West Berlin needed more than emergency packets and symbolic deliveries. It needed tonnage. It needed cargo measured not only by aircraft, but by the cumulative weight that could be brought in day after day. That pressure would soon drive the operation toward larger aircraft, especially the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, but the first chapter of the airlift had to begin with what was available and what could fly immediately. For the British, Operation Plainfare formed the second half of the same answer. Britain had its own sector in Berlin, its own airfield at Gatow, and its own military and political stake in refusing to let the blockade decide the future of the city. British aircraft began feeding supplies into Berlin from the western zones, linking their effort with the American one not as a gesture of sympathy, but as a practical, shared campaign. The blockade had tested whether the Western Allies would hold together. The airlift forced that unity into a daily operating schedule. This is one of the quiet truths of the Berlin Airlift. Its drama was not only in the danger, it was in repetition. The same basic act had to be performed again and again. Cargo was assembled in Western Germany. It was loaded into aircraft. The planes flew to Berlin. They landed at airfields inside the western sectors. Crews and ground workers unloaded what the city needed. The aircraft turned around and returned for more. Every link in that chain had to function. If supplies could not be gathered, the aircraft would fly empty. If the loading crews were too slow, aircraft would sit idle. If the airfields in Berlin could not absorb the traffic, the whole system would back up. If the aircraft were too small, the number of flights would become unmanageable. If weather closed the approaches, the city would feel the shortage. What began as a political decision rapidly became a contest of systems. The cargo itself shows why the operation was more than a gesture. Food was essential, but food alone could not preserve West Berlin. Coal and other fuel were indispensable because a city consumes energy constantly, whether its rail lines are open or blocked. Hospitals needed medicine and supplies. Utilities needed equipment. Machines needed parts. Families needed soap and basic household goods. Newspapers mattered too, because information and morale were part of the struggle. A population under blockade had to know not only that planes were arriving, but that it had not been forgotten. The airlift also asked something of Berliners themselves. The western sectors were not passive recipients of rescue. The city's survival depended on unloading, distribution, repair work, rationing, and endurance under pressure. Supplies arriving at Tempelhof or Gatow did not magically become meals, heat, or medicine. They had to be moved into the city's internal systems, divided, protected, and used carefully. The blockade had turned ordinary urban life into a logistical problem, and the airlift was only the visible part of the answer. Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare also changed the meaning of the aircraft overhead. In wartime Europe, large aircraft had often meant destruction. In Berlin in 1948, the sound of engines began to take on a different meaning. A transport plane approaching the city carried flour, coal, fuel, medicine, or parts. It carried proof that the Western presence had not been severed. It carried the message that isolation on the map did not yet mean abandonment in practice. But this proof had to be renewed constantly. The blockade was not a single event that could be answered once. It was a continuing pressure, and so the answer had to be continuing as well. The first flights of Operation Vittles did not end the crisis. The beginning of Operation Plainfare did not guarantee success. These operations only established the principle that the Western Allies would try to supply Berlin by air for as long as necessary. That principle was bold, but it raised a new and unforgiving question. How could aircraft from Western Germany reach a city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone without turning every flight into a separate diplomatic confrontation? The answer rested on the agreed air access routes that still existed above the blocked roads and rails. The airlift could begin because there were defined paths into Berlin, narrow channels through which American and British aircraft could move. Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare had given the mission its names and its purpose. The next problem was the space through which that mission had to pass, the controlled corridors that became the lifeline of West Berlin. Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare gave the Western response a name, but names did not move cargo. For that, the Allies needed airspace, not open sky in any general sense, and not freedom to wander above Soviet-controlled territory, but carefully defined routes that had survived the breakdown of cooperation on the ground. Berlin's surface connections could be blocked at railway junctions, canals, roads, and checkpoints. Aircraft were different. They did not remove the danger of the crisis, but they changed its geography. A truck convoy could be halted on a road. A train could be stopped on a line. A barge could be held on a waterway. But an aircraft following an agreed corridor entered a space that had already been recognized as part of the post-war occupation system. That distinction became crucial. The airlift was not a casual decision to fly over hostile territory. It rested on defined air routes into a city that, politically, was divided among the four occupying powers, even though it sat deep inside the Soviet zone. There were 3 agreed air corridors into Berlin. One ran from Frankfurt to Berlin. One ran from Buckeberg to Berlin. One ran from Hamburg to Berlin. These routes linked the western occupation zones with the western sectors of the city, and when the blockade closed rail, road, and water access, they became the remaining arteries through which West Berlin could be kept alive. Each corridor was narrow by the standards of a continental crisis. The agreed width was 20 English miles, about 32 kilometers. On a map, the corridors formed thin passages across the Soviet occupation zone. In practice, they were more than lines. They were legal claims, operational channels, and daily tests of discipline. Cargo crews had to move through them without drifting outside the accepted limits. Controllers had to keep aircraft separated inside them. Commanders had to build an entire supply system around the fact that the Allies could not simply spread their traffic wherever the weather, convenience, or congestion suggested. The importance of the corridors was not only that they existed, it was that they imposed a structure. The blockade had turned West Berlin into an island, but the corridors defined the air bridge to that island. They narrowed the crisis into a kind of controlled passage. Every flight that entered one of those routes carried flour, coal, medicine, or machinery, but it also carried an argument that the Western powers retained access to their sectors of Berlin and that the Soviet blockade of the ground routes did not erase that access. The Frankfurt corridor was especially important for the American effort, connecting the American zone in Western Germany with Berlin. Buckeburg and Hamburg were tied to the British system, feeding aircraft toward the city from the northwest and north. Together, the 3 routes gave the airlift its basic shape. Aircraft could move in and out of Berlin in organized streams, rather than as scattered flights improvising their way across uncertain airspace. But the corridors alone did not complete the system. At Berlin itself, there was also the Berlin Control Zone. This was defined as the airspace within a 20-mile radius of the Allied Control Authority building, up to 10,000 feet. That zone mattered because all of the traffic coming through the corridors eventually had to converge near the city. Planes did not simply appear over Berlin and land wherever space allowed. They entered a regulated air environment where approaches, departures, altitude, and timing had to be controlled. The Allied Control Authority building symbolized the 4-power occupation structure that had been created after the war. By the summer of 1948, that structure was already under severe strain. The same city that had once been treated as a shared responsibility had become a point of confrontation. Yet the airspace arrangements connected to that system still had practical force. The corridors and a Berlin control zone were remnants of Allied agreement, and during the blockade, those remnants became decisive. This was one of the strange features of the Berlin crisis. The Soviet Union could make daily life in West Berlin almost impossible by cutting surface routes. It could pressure the city, disrupt supplies, and force the Western Allies into an emergency response. But it could not easily deny the existence of the air corridors without making the confrontation more direct and more dangerous. The Western Allies used that opening. They did not break through the blockade by force on the ground. They moved through a channel the occupation agreements had left in the air. That did not make the operation safe. A corridor 20 English miles wide sounds large until it must carry repeated cargo flights in difficult weather under political pressure toward crowded airfields inside a divided city. Pilots had to maintain course. Controllers had to manage traffic density. Aircraft had to enter, descend, land, unload, depart, and clear space for the next arrivals. A single mistake could disrupt the flow. A collision, a navigation error, or a pattern of flights straying outside the corridor could have consequences beyond the immediate loss of cargo. In Berlin, aviation procedure was also diplomacy. The corridors turned the airlift into a problem of precision. The Allies were not simply asking whether an aircraft could fly from Western Germany to Berlin. Individual flights had already shown that this was possible. The harder question was whether thousands upon thousands of flights could move through the same limited spaces often enough to sustain an urban population. The answer depended on order. Routes had to be assigned. Altitudes had to be managed. Airfields had to receive aircraft at predictable intervals. Ground crews had to unload quickly enough that the sky behind each landing aircraft did not begin to back up. This is why controlled airspace became a lifeline rather than just a technical detail. The city's survival was measured in tons, but those tons first had to pass through air lanes. Food, fuel, medicine, coal, and spare parts were visible once they arrived at Tempelhof or Gatow, and later at Tegel. But before they were cargo on Berlin ground, they were weight inside aircraft moving through narrow corridors across a tense occupation frontier. The corridors transformed distance into a schedule, and schedule into survival. For West Berliners, the result was heard before it was seen in any warehouse ledger. Aircraft approached again and again, the sound of engines becoming part of the city's daily atmosphere. Each arrival proved that the city had not been sealed completely. The blockade had made Berlin vulnerable because geography placed it inside the Soviet zone. The corridors complicated that geography. They did not free the city. They did not end the crisis. But they prevented isolation from becoming absolute. For the Soviet leadership, this created a strategic problem. The blockade was meant to apply pressure without immediately starting a shooting war. The airlift answered in the same narrow space between surrender and escalation. By using the agreed corridors, the Western Allies avoided sending armed convoys down blocked roads, but they also refused to withdraw. The aircraft were not combat formations attacking Soviet positions. They were cargo planes following recognized routes. That made them politically difficult to stop without raising the stakes of the confrontation dramatically. The entire operation, therefore, rested on a fragile combination of law, logistics, and nerve. The Allies had to insist on their rights without provoking unnecessary incidents. They had to fly enough cargo to matter without losing control of the air traffic. They had to treat the corridors as both protected access and confined machinery. In that sense, the airlift was never only an act of generosity or endurance. It was a disciplined occupation operation built inside limits that could not be ignored. Those limits shaped every later improvement. Larger aircraft would matter because each flight through the corridors used precious space and time. Better runways would matter because the stream of traffic had to keep moving once it reached Berlin. Radar, radio control, and ground-controlled approach procedures would matter because weather and congestion could not be allowed to break the rhythm. The air corridors were the skeleton of the airlift. Everything else had to be fitted to them. In the first phase, the Western Allies had proved that flights could begin. The three corridors showed how those flights could continue without turning every crossing of the Soviet zone into a new argument. But the next question was brutally practical. If the number of safe passages through the air was limited, then each passage had to carry as much as possible. That pressure would push the airlift beyond the smaller Douglas C-47 and toward heavier aircraft capable of turning a narrow lifeline into a working supply system. The corridors gave the airlift its shape, but aircraft gave it its weight. Once the routes from Frankfurt, Buckeberg, and Hamburg had become the narrow channels of survival, the question was no longer whether an airplane could reach Berlin. The question was what that airplane could carry when it arrived, how often it could fly, and whether the entire system could grow from emergency relief into something closer to an industrial supply line. In the first phase, much of the American effort depended on the Douglas C-47. It was a familiar aircraft, already tied to the Allied memory of the Second World War, and it could operate in the rough, improvised conditions that often defined post-war Europe. For the opening days of Operation Vittles, that mattered. The crisis had arrived quickly. The blockade began on June 24, 1948. The American airlift began on June 26. There was no time to design a new fleet for Berlin. The aircraft available had to be used. The C-47 was useful because it was ready, proven, and present, but it was not large enough to solve the problem by itself. Berlin did not need a symbolic delivery. It needed food, fuel, medicine, machinery, and all the ordinary materials that allowed a modern city to keep functioning. It needed coal in enormous quantities, not just for comfort, but for heat, electricity, and essential power. A plane that could carry only a smaller load demanded more flights, more crews, more runway time, more unloading labor, and more congestion inside the corridors. The limits of the C-47 were therefore not only mechanical. They were strategic. Every aircraft entering the air corridors occupied a place in a carefully controlled stream. Each landing at Tempelhof or Gatow took time on the ground. Each departure had to fit back into the rhythm of the operation. If a smaller aircraft used almost the same corridor space and airfield attention as a larger one, then the smaller aircraft made the entire system less efficient. The problem was not bravery. Crews were flying. Cargo was moving. The problem was scale. That is why the Douglas CF-54 Skymaster became central to the American airlift. The C-54 could carry up to about 10 tons, roughly 4 times the capacity of the smaller C-47. That single difference changed the logic of the operation. A flight was no longer just a flight. It became a unit of capacity. With the C-54, each trip through the narrow lifeline could bring a much larger share of what Berlin needed to survive. The change also pointed toward a different kind of airlift. Early flights had the feeling of improvisation. Use what was available, move what could be moved, keep the city supplied for another day. The heavier aircraft helped turn that improvisation into a system. Larger loads meant fewer flights were needed for the same amount of cargo, or, more importantly, that the same number of flights could deliver far more. In a crisis where the surface routes were closed and the air corridors were limited, this was not a marginal improvement. It was the foundation of success. The Skymaster also fit the airlift's deeper requirement: predictability. Berlin could not be supplied by heroic exceptions. It had to be supplied by routine. Planes had to arrive, unload, refuel, or turn around, and leave with a discipline that would eventually make the air bridge resemble a moving assembly line in the sky. Standardized, higher-capacity aircraft made that easier. The more the operation could depend on similar aircraft with similar performance and similar cargo capacity, the easier it became to schedule the stream, calculate deliveries, and reduce waste in the system. The United States Navy also contributed through its R-5D version of the C-54. That detail matters because the Berlin Airlift was not only an Army or Air Force response in the broad public imagination. It drew on a wider American aviation inventory, including naval transport aircraft that could perform the same essential heavy cargo role. The name was different, but the function in the airlift was closely tied to the Skymaster family: carry more, fly reliably, and help keep the flow into Berlin from breaking under the weight of demand. The British side of the airlift developed its own mix of aircraft. Operation Plainfare did not simply mirror the American effort. British crews brought in a varied fleet that included the Avro Lancastrian, the Avro York, the Handley Page Hastings, and the Short Sunderland flying boat. Each name points to the same basic reality. The airlift was multinational, improvised at first, and technically diverse. Britain had to draw on what it had, adapt it to the Berlin mission, and feed those aircraft into the same larger pattern of corridors, control zones, landing fields, and daily tonnage targets. The Avro Lancastrian and Avro York reflected Britain's immediate post-war transport resources, aircraft connected to the country's wartime aviation experience, and its effort to meet a new kind of peacetime emergency. The Handley Page Hastings represented another part of that transport capacity, adding to the British ability to move cargo into the city. And the Short Sunderland flying boat showed how flexible the response could become. In a blockade where rail, road, and water routes into West Berlin had been cut, even the categories of aircraft used in the answer became part of the story. The aim was simple, but the means were varied. Keep supplies moving, through the air, against a blockade designed to make that impossible. These aircraft did not operate in isolation. They belonged to a wider machine that was still being invented. The flights had to match the corridors. The corridors had to match Berlin's receiving fields. The fields had to withstand the impact of aircraft arriving heavy and leaving again in constant sequence. Every improvement in one part of the system created pressure somewhere else. Bigger aircraft carried more cargo, but they also demanded more from runways, taxiways, unloading crews, maintenance teams, and air traffic control. That was the quiet trade-off inside the shift from the C-47 to the C-54. The larger aircraft made the airlift viable at scale, but they also exposed the weakness of facilities that had not been designed for such relentless use. The airlift could not be measured only by tons in the hold. It had to be measured by whether those tons could be landed safely, unloaded quickly, and replaced by the next aircraft without delay. Tempelhof in the American sector and Gatow in the British sector now became more than names on a map. They became the receiving end of the entire Western decision to remain in Berlin. Every C-54 arriving with coal or food translated diplomatic resolve into physical pressure on concrete, steel matting, and runway surfaces. The heavier the aircraft and the more disciplined the schedule, the more the ground itself became part of the struggle. The early reliance on the CF-47 had shown that Berlin could be reached. The rise of the C-54 Skymaster showed that Berlin might be sustained. British aircraft and the United States Navy R-5D widened the effort, turning a national response into a combined air supply campaign. But cargo capacity alone could not save the city. The aircraft still needed somewhere to land, and the strain of repeated heavy arrivals soon made clear that the airlift's next battle would be fought on the runways of West Berlin. The larger aircraft had solved one problem and exposed another. A C-54 Skymaster could bring far more into Berlin than the smaller C-47, and that made each flight more valuable. But it also made each landing more punishing. The airlift was becoming heavier, more frequent, and less forgiving. The stress moved from the sky to the ground, from the question of whether aircraft could reach Berlin to whether Berlin's airfields could survive being used almost like factory machinery. At the beginning, the western sectors had two main receiving points, Tempelhof in the American sector and Gatow in the British sector. These were not incidental locations. They became the points where the abstract promise to hold West Berlin was translated into tons of coal, sacks of flour, fuel, medicine, spare parts, and machinery. Every aircraft that crossed the Soviet zone still had to slow, descend, land, unload, and get out again. If the runways failed, the air bridge failed with them. Tempelhof carried a special weight in this story. It was in the American sector, close to the city it was trying to feed, and it quickly became one of the most visible symbols of the operation. To Berliners, the aircraft arriving there were not distant evidence of policy. They were overhead sound, runway dust, engines, wheels, and cargo. The airfield became a place where survival could be measured in arrivals. But Tempelhof was also a vulnerable piece of infrastructure. The airlift's first weeks were not an orderly, mature system. They were an emergency. Aircraft were arriving into a city under blockade, and the pressure to increase deliveries rose almost immediately. As the mission shifted toward heavier aircraft, the physical surface of the field began to show the cost. Earlier landing mats and runway surfaces at Tempelhof had not been built for the relentless pounding of fully loaded heavy transports. Steel landing mats and perforated plates could serve in wartime and emergency conditions, but the airlift was something different. Repeated landings by aircraft carrying cargo at high weights, day after day, in a city with no surface supply line to fall back on. The C-54 made the airlift more efficient in the air, but on the ground, it concentrated force. More cargo per aircraft meant more weight on every approach, every touchdown, every taxi, and every turn. The result was predictable, but dangerous. The runway infrastructure at Tempelhof had to be expanded and repaired because heavy-loaded aircraft damaged the earlier surfaces. What looked at first like a flying problem had become an engineering problem. It was not enough to send more aircraft. The receiving field had to be strengthened, widened, repaired, and adapted while the crisis was still unfolding. New runway construction at Tempelhof began in July 1948, only weeks after the blockade began and only days after Operation Vittles had started. That timing matters. It shows how quickly the airlift outgrew its improvised beginnings. The Western Allies were not merely testing whether they could make a few emergency flights into Berlin. By July, they were already building for a larger and longer operation. This was the practical rhythm of the Berlin Airlift. Aircraft capacity drove runway demand. Runway damage drove construction. Construction increased throughput. Increased throughput made it possible to bring in more cargo, which in turn justified still more disciplined scheduling and heavier reliance on larger transports. Each improvement created the need for the next one. Tempelhof became not just an airfield, but a working part of an industrial supply system. The pressure at Tempelhof also revealed a basic truth about the blockade. The Soviet move had cut roads, rail lines, and waterways, but it had not only created a diplomatic standoff. It had forced the Western Allies to rebuild the meaning of access itself. Access was no longer a train arriving at a station or a barge moving along a canal. Access became a controlled descent through crowded airspace, a hard landing on a repaired surface, a rapid unloading process, and a takeoff that cleared room for the next aircraft teeting. Gatow, in the British sector, was the other original main airfield in West Berlin. While Tempelhof was tied to the American effort, Gatow became central to the British side of the airlift, Operation Plainfare. Its importance lay partly in geography and partly in division of labor. West Berlin was divided into sectors, and the airlift had to use the receiving fields available inside those sectors. Gatow allowed British aircraft to feed the city through their own operational channel, connecting the British effort from Western Germany to Berlin's British sector. The British aircraft mix was different from the American one. Avro Lancastrians, Avro Yorks, Handley Page Hastings aircraft, and short Sunderland flying boats all formed part of the wider British contribution. Those aircraft did not make Gatow a secondary place. They made it one of the points where the combined airlift became real. The survival of West Berlin depended not on a single runway or a single national effort, but on a network of aircraft, fields, corridors, ground crews, and unloading systems that could keep functioning under pressure. Tempelhof and Gatow together show why the airlift should not be imagined only as a stream of aircraft in the sky. The sky was essential, but it was only one layer of the operation. Beneath it was a constant struggle over surfaces. Runways had to bear weight. Taxi routes had to keep aircraft moving. Apron areas had to handle cargo and crews. Damaged sections had to be repaired without stopping the flow. The blockade made every delay meaningful because delay did not only inconvenience pilots. It reduced the city's supply of heat, food, and power. This was especially important because coal would become the largest category of airlift cargo. Coal was heavy, dirty, and unforgiving. It was also essential for electricity, heating, and basic urban function. Feeding Berlin was not only a matter of calories. It was a matter of keeping a city from freezing, darkening, and shutting down. The larger the share of heavy cargo, the more the airfields themselves became part of the city's survival infrastructure. At Tempelhof, the damage caused by heavy aircraft made clear that the airlift's success depended on constant adaptation. Repair was not a background activity. It was part of the campaign. Construction crews and planners had to think in terms of repeated stress, not occasional use. The runway surface had to meet the needs of a crisis that had no fixed end date. No one in July 1948 could know with certainty how long the blockade would last. That uncertainty forced the Allies to build as if the airlift might have to continue indefinitely. There was a quiet irony in this. The Soviet blockade had been designed to make West Berlin untenable, to show that a city surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory could not be sustained by the Western powers. Yet the longer the airlift continued, the more the Western presence took physical form. New construction at Tempelhof, heavy aircraft arriving in disciplined patterns, British operations through Gatow, and the growing repair effort all turned the Western commitment into infrastructure. It was no longer just a statement issued from Washington or London. It was concrete, steel, labor, and landing gear. Still, Tempelhof and Gatow had limits. They were lifelines, but they were also bottlenecks. Every aircraft needed space. Every landing required a runway clear of the previous plane. Every unloading operation consumed minutes, men, vehicles, and apron room. As traffic increased, the original two main fields carried an enormous burden. Their existence made the airlift possible, but their limitations shaped every decision that followed. That is why the story of Tempelhof's damaged surfaces matters. It was not a minor maintenance problem. It was evidence that the airlift had entered a new phase. The mission had grown beyond emergency improvisation and was becoming a sustained logistical contest. If the Western Allies intended to keep West Berlin alive, they needed not only more aircraft and better traffic control. They needed more ground capacity inside the city itself. The answer would come in the French sector, where an airfield did not simply wait to be used. It had to be built under emergency conditions, with rubble, asphalt, hand tools, and civilian labor. Tempelhof and Gatow had become lifelines. But as the weight of the airlift increased, West Berlin needed another one. Tempelhof and Gatow had kept the airlift alive in its first critical weeks, but they also revealed the limit of survival by improvisation. Every heavier aircraft that came down onto a strained runway brought food, coal, or medicine into West Berlin, and at the same time consumed a little more of the surface beneath it. The airlift could not remain only a matter of brave crews and crowded schedules. It needed more concrete reality on the ground. It needed another place where aircraft could land, unload, turn around, and take off again. That place would be Tegel, in the French sector of Berlin. In the summer of 1948, Tegel was not yet the famous airport it would later become. It was an emergency answer to an emergency problem. The Soviet blockade had cut the rail, road, and water routes into the western sectors. Tempelhof, in the American sector, and Gatow, in the British sector, were already carrying the burden of the air supply effort. But the larger the operation became, the more obvious it was that two main airfields were not enough. A city of more than 2 million people could not depend indefinitely on bottlenecks that were already under heavy pressure. The French sector had to contribute a new lifeline. Construction at Tegel began on August 5, 1948. The target was not architectural elegance. It was capacity, speed, and endurance. The airfield had to be made usable quickly enough to matter while the blockade was still tightening around the city. According to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the work was completed on November 5, 1948. In 3 months, Berliners and Allied engineers turned an urgent requirement into a functioning airfield. The scale was enormous, especially for a city still living among the ruins of war. Tegel's emergency construction included a runway 5,500 feet long. It included 6,020 feet of taxiway. It included 4,400 feet of access road and 2,750 feet of access railroad. It also included more than 1 million square feet of apron space, the open working area where aircraft could be parked, unloaded, serviced, and moved back into the stream of traffic. Those measurements can sound like a list of engineering facts, but in the context of the blockade, they were political facts as well. A runway was not merely a strip of pavement. It was a refusal to accept isolation. A taxiway was not merely a connector between landing and loading. It was a way to keep aircraft moving so that one arrival did not block the next parkman. An access road and an access railroad were not background details. They were the ground arteries that would carry supplies away from the aircraft and into the city. Apron space meant that cargo planes could be handled in numbers, not one by one, in a slow and fragile sequence. Tegel showed that the airlift was never just an aviation story. It was a system. The planes made the blockade visible from the sky, but the system depended on what happened after the wheels touched down. Coal had to be unloaded. Food had to be moved. Fuel, machinery, soap, and medical supplies had to pass from aircraft holds into Berlin's daily life. A plane sitting too long on the ground was not only occupying space, it was breaking the rhythm of the entire air bridge. The labor that made Tegel possible came largely from German civilians. About 17,000 of them worked on the project, mostly women. They worked in 3 shifts, and they worked primarily with hand tools. This is one of the most important details in the history of Tegel because it changes the image of the airlift. The familiar picture is of cargo aircraft descending over rooftops, but behind that image were thousands of Berliners doing exhausting physical work, hour after hour, in a city that had already endured destruction, occupation, hunger, and political fear. The use of hand tools was not a romantic detail. It was a sign of scarcity and urgency. Post-war Berlin did not have an abundance of modern construction equipment ready for a project of this scale. What it did have was human labor, rubble, discipline, and the immediate understanding that this airfield could help keep the western sectors alive. The workers were not building an ordinary airport for peacetime travel. They were building a landing ground under the pressure of a Cold War confrontation. The materials themselves carried the story of the city. Shattered brick debris from destroyed Berlin buildings was used in the work. Rubble became part of the foundation of survival. A city that had been broken by war was, in a literal sense, being reused to resist a new form of pressure. The wreckage of Berlin did not disappear. It was gathered, moved, crushed, leveled, and made useful. Asphalt was also needed, and even that became part of the airlift's unusual logic. The research record notes that asphalt was flown in using 10,000 55-gallon drums. This is the kind of detail that captures the paradox of the operation. The Allies were flying supplies into Berlin because surface routes had been blocked, and some of those supplies were then used to build the airfield that would make more flying possible. The airlift fed itself. It carried not only the cargo that Berlin needed to survive, but also the means to expand the operation that carried the cargo. Every element of Tegel's construction answered a logistical weakness. The runway gave heavy aircraft another destination inside West Berlin. The taxiway reduced delays after landing and before takeoff. The apron space allowed more aircraft to be handled without choking the field. The access road and access railroad connected the airfield to the city's distribution system. Nothing in the design was incidental. Each piece existed because time on the ground had become as precious as time in the air. The timing also mattered. Work began in early August, after the airlift had already proven that flights could reach Berlin, but before anyone could know whether the Western Allies could sustain the city through the coming months. By November 5, 1948, when Tegel was completed, the crisis had entered a more severe phase. The blockade had not collapsed. Winter was approaching. Coal would become even more essential. Weather would become more hostile. Fog, darkness, and cold would make the air bridge harder to maintain. Tegel did not end those problems. It did something more practical. It gave the airlift additional room to fight them. In military and logistical terms, more runway capacity meant more flexibility. If one field was damaged, congested, or limited by conditions, another could absorb part of the burden. If aircraft arrivals increased, the system had more space to receive them. If the airlift was to become a disciplined industrial operation rather than an emergency improvisation, it required exactly this kind of expansion. The construction of Tegel turned West Berlin itself into part of the answer to the blockade. There was also a quieter symbolic force in the work. The Soviet blockade was designed to make West Berlin dependent, vulnerable, and eventually politically untenable. Tegel's construction showed the opposite. Not that the city was safe, and not that its suffering had ended, but that its people and its occupiers could organize under pressure. The airfield was built by civilians who were not flying the aircraft and not negotiating in the capitals, but whose labor altered the capacity of the entire operation. The fact that most of those workers were women also belongs at the center of the story. Post-war German cities depended heavily on women's labor in the ruins, and Tegel extended that reality into the machinery of the Cold War. The airlift is often remembered through pilots, commanders, and aircraft types. Tegel reminds us that the air bridge rested on hands as well as wings. By the time aircraft could use Tegel, the airlift had become more than a demonstration of resolve. It was becoming infrastructure. The West was no longer simply proving that it would not leave Berlin. It was building the means to stay. Runways, taxiways, roads, rail access, and aprons became part of the political answer to Stalin's pressure. Each new landing surface made the blockade less decisive. But more airfields also created a new challenge. As the system expanded, the air over Berlin grew more crowded and less forgiving. More runways could receive more aircraft, but only if those aircraft could be guided safely through narrow corridors, bad weather, darkness, and heavy traffic. The next struggle would be fought not with shovels and rubble, but with radio discipline, radar screens, and the precise choreography of ground-controlled approach shifting. Tegel gave the airlift more ground beneath it. Now the air bridge had to become more exact in the sky. Tegel gave the airlift more ground beneath it. But ground capacity alone could not solve the problem that was now forming above West Berlin. The air bridge had become a moving chain of aircraft, and every link in that chain had to arrive at the right time at the right altitude, on the right heading, and in weather that did not always cooperate. The blockade had turned geography into a weapon. The airlift answered by turning airspace into a disciplined system. By the time Tempelhof, Gatow, and then Tegel were all part of the effort, the Allied supply operation was no longer a series of individual flights into a besieged city. It was a controlled stream. Aircraft came from Western Germany through the agreed corridors, Frankfurt to Berlin, Buckeberg to Berlin, and Hamburg to Berlin. Those corridors had already given the Western Allies a legal and operational path through Soviet-controlled territory. But as traffic increased, they also became crowded lanes of responsibility. A pilot was not simply flying toward Berlin. He was entering a narrow, regulated lifeline where one mistake could affect every aircraft behind him. This is where radio discipline became as important as engine power. The cargo aircraft of the airlift carried coal, food, medicine, machinery, and the necessities of civilian survival, but they also carried something less visible: instructions. Crews needed headings, altitudes, weather information, clearance to proceed, and landing guidance. The more aircraft entered the system, the less room there was for improvisation. A delay in one place could ripple outward. A missed approach could force decisions in the air. Bad visibility could turn an already demanding pattern into a dangerous one. Berlin's weather made that discipline essential. Fog, darkness, low cloud, and poor visibility could not be allowed to stop the airlift every time conditions deteriorated. West Berlin's need for coal did not pause because the approach to Tempelhof was difficult. The city's food requirements did not wait for clear skies. If the blockade was to be defeated, the airlift had to work not only on good days, but through weather that would normally slow or stop dense air traffic. The answer lay in a combination of radio, radar, and ground-controlled approach procedures. Ground-controlled approach, often known by its initials, GCA, helped turn a landing in poor visibility into a guided conversation between the aircraft and controllers on the ground. Instead of relying only on what a pilot could see outside the cockpit, the aircraft could be tracked and directed by people watching instruments and radar returns. The controller could guide the pilot step by step, correcting the approach until the runway environment came into view, or until the aircraft reached the point where the attempt had to be abandoned. For an ordinary airport, this was a technical aid. For the Berlin Airlift, it was part of the survival mechanism. The operation was not just trying to land planes in Berlin. It was trying to keep planes landing in a rhythm dense enough to feed and fuel a city. In that setting, a runway was only useful if aircraft could reach it safely and predictably. Radar and radio made the sky more measurable. Ground-controlled approach made the final moments of flight less dependent on chance. Tempelhof, already one of the central lifelines of the American sector, became a symbol of this technical adaptation. Its runways and surfaces had been strained by repeated heavy landings, and its role in the airlift forced constant attention to capacity. But the development of Tempelhof was not only concrete, mats, and repair work. It also extended upward into the airspace above the city. A long-distance radar system was installed on the main building at Tempelhof to monitor airspace within about a 100-kilometer radius. That single detail shows how far the airlift had moved beyond emergency improvisation. The Allies were not only fixing runways after aircraft damaged them. They were building a system that could see, direct, and protect the flow of aircraft before those aircraft reached the field. The importance of that radar was not abstract. Aircraft approaching Berlin came through limited corridors and entered the Berlin control zone, where the margin for confusion was small. The airlift depended on repeated arrivals and departures, often under pressure and often with little slack in the schedule. Knowing what was in the air, where it was, and how it was moving gave controllers the ability to maintain order. In a campaign built on volume, order was safety, and safety was capacity. The later addition of lighting for fog and darkness added another layer to the same discipline. A runway in daylight was one thing. A runway in darkness, haze, or winter weather was another. Lights did not change the politics of the blockade, but they changed the practical question of whether another aircraft could land, unload, and return westward. Fog and night had always been natural limits on aviation. In Berlin, those limits became problems to be engineered around. Better lighting helped keep Tempelhof usable when visibility and darkness would otherwise threaten the tempo of the air bridge. What made these systems powerful was not one invention alone. Radar without disciplined procedures could identify traffic but not necessarily move it efficiently. Radio without reliable organization could become noise. Ground-controlled approach without trained crews and controllers could not produce the steady confidence the airlift required. The achievement was in the combination. Aircraft crews accepting instructions, controllers maintaining separation, airfields receiving one plane after another, and the whole system operating under rules strict enough to make repetition possible. That repetition was the quiet heart of the airlift. A single dramatic flight could lift morale. A few successful days could prove that Berlin had not been abandoned. But the blockade could not be answered by gestures. It had to be answered by tonnage, and tonnage came from thousands of controlled movements. Each aircraft that landed in fog or darkness represented more than a safe approach. It represented another preserved slot in the chain, another load delivered, another hour in which Soviet pressure failed to break the city's link to the West. The air bridge also demanded a change in how people thought about risk. Aviation had always involved judgment, but this operation reduced the space for personal preference. Pilots, crews, and controllers were part of a larger machine. The point was not to show individual daring by improvising around the system. The point was to trust the system enough that many aircraft could fly where a few might once have flown. In that sense, the discipline of the air bridge was moral as well as technical. Every procedure existed because West Berlin's survival depended on reliability. There was also a political meaning hidden inside the radar screens and radio calls. Stalin's blockade had assumed that isolation could force a decision. Either the Western Allies would retreat or they would risk a ground confrontation. The airlift found a third path, but that path could survive only if it became dependable. Each successful instrument-guided approach in bad weather made the blockade less effective. Each controlled landing in darkness extended the working day of the airlift. Each improvement at Tempelhof, Gatow, or Tegel turned a vulnerable enclave into a city connected by procedure, equipment, and resolve. By the end of this phase, the airlift was becoming less like a rescue attempt and more like an industrial operation in the sky. The runways were being expanded and repaired. Tegel had been built under emergency conditions. Tempelhof had gained radar reach and improved lighting. Radio and ground-controlled approach gave controllers and crews a way to keep moving when the weather narrowed the world to instruments and voices. But the more precise the air bridge became, the more it required command discipline to match its technology. Radar could show the traffic. Radio could direct it. Lighting could help bring it home. Yet the whole operation still needed a commander who could turn procedures into a relentless pattern. Aircraft spaced, arrivals standardized, unloading accelerated, crews kept close to their machines, and every wasted minute treated as lost capacity. The technical skeleton of the air bridge was now in place. What remained was to make it move with the regularity of a machine. The technical skeleton of the air bridge was now in place. Radar could see farther than the eye. Radio could hold a pilot on course through cloud and darkness. Ground-controlled approach could talk an aircraft down when Berlin's weather erased the runway until the last moments of flight. But none of that, by itself, could make the airlift dependable enough to feed and warm a city. What the operation needed was not only courage in the cockpit. It needed rhythm. That rhythm came under Major General William H. Tunner. Tunner took command of the Combined Airlift Task Force at the point when the Berlin operation had already outgrown improvisation. The first flights had proved that West Berlin could be supplied by air for a few days, perhaps for a few weeks. But the blockade had not ended. Soviet pressure remained in place. The Western Allies were no longer asking whether aircraft could reach Berlin. They were asking whether an airlift could become a permanent industrial process, repeated hour after hour, day after day, in weather good and bad, without collapsing under its own complexity. Tunner's answer was precision. He treated the airlift as a system in which every minute on the ground, every variation in procedure, and every unnecessary movement by a crew had a cost. A cargo aircraft was valuable only when it was moving cargo. If it circled because traffic was confused, capacity was lost. If it waited on a ramp while crews looked for food, instructions, or maintenance help, capacity was lost. If aircraft types, loading practices, or landing patterns varied too widely, the whole operation became harder to predict. And in the narrow air corridors into Berlin, unpredictability was dangerous. The airlift was already confined by geography and agreement. Aircraft flew through the 3 recognized corridors into Berlin, each only 20 English miles, or about 32 kilometers wide. Inside the Berlin control zone, traffic had to be managed within a defined space around the Allied Control Authority building and up to 10,000 feet. These limits made Berlin's sky less like an open battlefield and more like a carefully controlled airway. Tunner's task was to fill that airway without clogging it. So he imposed disciplined traffic patterns. Aircraft would not simply arrive when they arrived. They would move in sequence, at assigned intervals, along planned routes, with controllers and crews working to keep the flow continuous. The system depended on spacing. Research on the airlift commonly emphasizes the use of tight intervals, including 3-minute spacing, as part of the operating discipline that allowed aircraft to keep entering the stream without breaking it. The principle was simple, but the execution was unforgiving. A small delay could ripple backward through the chain. A missed approach could affect aircraft behind it. A pilot who could not land under the procedure did not circle endlessly over Berlin, consuming fuel and space. The point was to keep the line moving. This was one of Tunner's most important contributions. He understood that the airlift could not work if each flight was treated as an individual adventure. It had to become a procession. The pilot, the controller, the ground crew, the maintenance team, the loader, and the dispatcher all had to serve the same rhythm. The operation became less dramatic in appearance and more powerful in effect. On the ground, Tunner attacked another source of delay: turnaround time. A cargo plane that landed at Tempelhof, Gatow, or Tegel had to be unloaded quickly, serviced quickly, briefed quickly, and sent back into the flow. That meant the ramp itself had to function almost like a factory floor. The aircraft was not allowed to become a waiting room. Crews were kept near their planes during unloading. They did not scatter across the field in search of coffee, weather updates, orders, or mechanics. Instead, the system came to them. 3 vehicles typically met each arrival. One was a mobile canteen. Its purpose was practical, not sentimental. Crews flying repeated missions needed food and drink, but if they left the aircraft to get it, the operation lost time. By bringing refreshments directly to the plane, the airlift protected both crew endurance and schedule discipline. Another vehicle was a weather and operations car. This brought the information crews needed for the next leg: weather conditions, operational instructions, and the details that connected one flight to the larger pattern. In an operation shaped by fog, darkness, radio control, and narrow corridors, weather was not background. It was part of the machinery. A change in visibility or ceiling could alter the tempo of arrivals and departures. Crews needed current information without breaking the turnaround sequence. The third vehicle was a maintenance truck. This, too, reflected Tunner's understanding of time. Aircraft flying at high frequency required immediate attention. Small mechanical issues could become schedule problems. Schedule problems could become capacity problems. By meeting each aircraft directly, maintenance crews could inspect, repair, and clear planes with minimal delay. The airlift could not afford to discover problems late in the process. These details sound modest: a canteen, an operations car, a maintenance truck. But they reveal the deeper nature of Tunner's command. He was not merely ordering more flights. He was removing friction from the entire chain. He looked at the aircraft not as isolated machines, but as moving parts in a larger mechanism. The cargo mattered, but so did the coffee. The route mattered, but so did where the crew stood while the cargo came off. The runway mattered, but so did the truck that reached the aircraft at the right moment. Standardization was central to this approach. Earlier in the airlift, a variety of aircraft had played roles, including the smaller Douglas C-47 and the larger Douglas C-54 Skymaster. The shift toward the C-54 mattered because it made the operation more predictable. The C-54 could carry up to about 10 tons, roughly 4 times the capacity of a C-47. Just as important, a more standardized fleet simplified loading, unloading, maintenance, scheduling, and traffic control. The more alike the aircraft were in performance and capacity, the easier it became to build a steady pattern around them. Tunner's airlift was therefore not only a feat of aviation. It was a lesson in operational design. The aircraft in the sky depended on the choreography below. A pilot approaching Berlin through cloud might be guided by radar and radio, but that approach mattered only if the runway, Ramp, unloading crew, fuel, weather information, and maintenance support were ready. Precision in the sky required precision on the ground. The Combined Airlift Task Force gave this system a single, disciplined frame. American and British efforts had begun as Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare, with aircraft moving food, fuel, and essential goods from Western Germany into West Berlin. Under Tunner's command, the combined operation became more than a collection of national efforts. It became a coordinated air bridge. That coordination did not erase the complexity of the mission. It made the complexity manageable. The stakes of this discipline were measured not in abstract efficiency, but in survival. West Berlin needed steady supply, not heroic bursts. A city could not plan its bread, heat, electricity, and medicine around irregular acts of bravery. It needed tonnage. It needed predictability. It needed an airlift that could keep operating when crews were tired, engines needed repair, fog settled over the city, and Soviet pressure remained unresolved. That is why Tunner's contribution was so decisive. He turned the airlift from a response into a machine, and the machine had its own quiet logic. Aircraft entered the corridor. Controllers held the sequence. Radar and radio guided the descent. The plane landed. Cargo came off. The crew stayed near the aircraft. The canteen arrived. The weather and operations car arrived. The maintenance truck arrived. The aircraft was cleared, turned, and sent back west to load again. Then another aircraft came in behind it, and another after that. There was no single moment in that process that won the Berlin crisis. The power came from repetition. The blockade had tried to isolate West Berlin by cutting rail, road, and water access. Tunner's system answered by making the air itself behave like an assembly line. It did not break the blockade with one dramatic flight. It wore down the logic of the blockade with thousands of disciplined arrivals. In that sense, the airlift became one of the early Cold War's clearest demonstrations of industrial patience. The Western Allies were not trying to seize territory. They were not forcing a convoy through Soviet-controlled roads. They were proving that a city could be sustained through controlled airspace if the operation was organized with enough discipline to turn flight into routine. The routine was the victory taking shape. By the time Tunner's methods were fully in motion, the question was no longer whether aircraft could bring supplies to Berlin. The question was how much they could bring and for how long. That question leads from procedures to payloads, from traffic patterns to the contents of the cargo holds: coal for heat and power, food for daily survival, medicine, machinery, soap, newspapers, and stranger items that showed how completely an isolated city had come to depend on the air bridge. The machine of precision had been built. Now its true measure would be found in what it carried. The machine of precision had been built. Its schedules, corridors, approach procedures, and ground routines could be measured in minutes. But for Berliners waiting below, the airlift was not an abstract triumph of organization. It was the coal dust on a worker's coat. It was flour, dried potatoes, powdered milk, medicine, soap, and the paper that carried the morning news. It was electricity when power could be kept running, heat when winter pressed against damaged buildings, and the proof that isolation did not have to mean abandonment. The scale is still difficult to hold in the mind. By the time the airlift ended, Western aircraft had carried more than 2.3 million tons of supplies into Berlin. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force gives the total as 2,325,510 tons. Britannica gives a closely related figure, 2,323,738 tons. The difference between those totals is small beside the larger fact: a city deep inside the Soviet zone had been kept alive by air. Most of that cargo was not dramatic in appearance. It did not look like a single decisive weapon or a single heroic rescue. It looked like bulk. It looked like sacks, crates, drums, machines, and black coal pouring out of cargo holds. The airlift succeeded because it could carry the ordinary materials of urban survival in extraordinary quantities. Coal was the largest share. About 1.5 million tons of it came into Berlin by air. That fact changes how the airlift should be understood. It was not only a food operation. It was not only a humanitarian bridge for hungry civilians. It was also an energy operation. Berlin needed coal for heat, for electricity, and for the basic functioning of a modern city that had already been battered by war. Without fuel, food alone would not preserve daily life. Homes would grow colder. Power would fail. Workshops, hospitals, water systems, and essential services would be pushed toward paralysis. Coal also explains why the airlift had to become so disciplined. A symbolic handful of flights could show resolve, but coal required tonnage. Coal filled aircraft quickly, and it had to arrive constantly. The move from improvised relief toward an industrial system was not only a matter of pride or military efficiency, it was dictated by the cargo itself. A city's heat and power could not depend on occasional success. They required repetition. Food came next in scale, more than 500,000 tons. In the cargo holds, food meant more than calories counted on a planning chart. It meant the daily routines by which civilians held themselves together under pressure. It meant bread, or the ingredients that could become bread. It meant meals in households where people knew that the rail lines, roads, and waterways had been cut. It meant confidence that the Western commitment to Berlin could be tasted at the table, not just heard in speeches. The airlift's food cargo also gave the blockade a political meaning on the ground. The Soviet pressure on West Berlin was designed to make the Western position seem impossible. If the city could not be supplied, then its people would face a cruel choice between hunger and political submission. Every aircraft that landed with food weakened that calculation. The delivery of flour or canned goods was therefore both practical and political. It said that the blockade had not closed the city's connection to the outside world. Medicine formed a smaller part of the total weight, but its importance cannot be measured only by tonnage. Medical supplies moved through the same narrow air bridge as coal and food, sharing space in a system that had no room for waste. Hospitals and clinics in an isolated city could not be treated as afterthoughts. Illness did not pause for diplomacy. Injuries, chronic conditions, childbirth, infection, and the ordinary emergencies of civilian life continued while the blockade tightened around West Berlin. Medicine helped preserve not just survival in the general sense, but the fragile individual lives hidden inside the larger statistics. Then there were the other necessities, the items that make the airlift feel less like a military diagram and more like the supply system of an entire city. Soap was carried in. That detail is quiet, but revealing. Cleanliness was health, dignity, and routine. In a city of shortages and damaged infrastructure, soap was not a luxury. It belonged to the same world of survival as food and fuel. Newspapers were carried too. They weighed little compared with coal, but their significance was different. A newspaper connected Berliners to information, argument, morale, and public life. Under blockade conditions, news was part of resistance. People needed to know what was happening beyond the sectors and beyond the Soviet-controlled territory around them. They needed evidence that they had not disappeared from history. The planes brought calories and coal, but they also carried the printed words by which a besieged population could understand its own moment. Some cargo was stranger because it showed the airlift stretching beyond the emergency image of sacks and fuel. Dismantled steamrollers were flown into Berlin. So was electrical power plant machinery? These were not small comforts. They were heavy reminders that West Berlin was not only being kept alive from day to day. It also had to keep functioning as a city with roads, utilities, repairs, and infrastructure. A steamroller could not simply be wished through a blockade. It had to be taken apart, loaded, flown, unloaded, and put back to use. Power plant machinery carried the same message, Toothpaste carried the same message. The airlift was not merely feeding a population until politics changed. It was trying to preserve the working capacity of the city itself. Those unusual loads also revealed a hidden truth about the operation. The aircraft were not just replacing a missing grocery route. They were substituting, as far as possible, for railroads, roads, and waterways. Before the blockade, a city was supplied by systems built for mass movement on the ground and by water. After June 24, 1948, the western sectors had to depend on aircraft moving through the agreed corridors from Western Germany into Berlin. That meant cargo planners had to think not only about what was urgently needed, but what could physically fit, what could be broken down, what could be prioritized, and what could wait. Every ton carried a decision. Coal competed with food. Machinery competed with medicine. Soap competed with spare parts. The airlift was a constant act of selection, shaped by need, weather, aircraft capacity, runway conditions, and the unforgiving rhythm of arrivals and departures. Tunner's precision mattered because the cargo list was so broad. A delayed aircraft was not only a late aircraft, it was late heat, late bread, late medicine, late maintenance, or late news. The names of the operations themselves, Operation Vittles and Operation Plainfare, suggested food and daily provision, but the cargo expanded beyond those labels. The American and British efforts became a moving inventory of an urban society under siege. West Berlin needed the basics that every city needs, but it needed them through a channel only a few miles wide in the sky, under the pressure of Cold War confrontation. And then there was Clarence. Clarence was a baby camel connected with the U.S. 525th Fighter Squadron. In the long catalog of coal, food, medical supplies, soap, newspapers, machinery, and dismantled steamrollers, Clarence stands out almost absurdly. Yet the story matters because it shows how the airlift, while built on tonnage, also became a human event with room for surprise. The presence of a baby camel in the history of the Berlin Airlift does not reduce the seriousness of the operation. It sharpens it. Only a supply line that had become part of daily life could carry both the grim necessities of survival and the odd, memorable cargo that people would remember afterward. That mixture of massive and intimate cargo gave the airlift its emotional force. The statistics prove its achievement: more than 2.3 million tons in all, about 1.5 million tons of coal, more than 500,000 tons of food. But the smaller details explain why those totals mattered. Soap meant washing. Newspapers meant connection. Medicine meant care. Machinery meant that the city still had systems worth repairing. Clarence the baby camel meant that even inside a geopolitical crisis, life retained its strange and human edges. For Stalin's blockade to work, West Berlin had to become unsustainable. It had to become a place where the Western Allies could not provide enough, and where civilians would eventually be forced to accept the consequences. The cargo holds of the airlift turned that pressure back, not with a single dramatic blow, but with accumulation. One aircraft, then another. One load of coal, then another. One delivery of food, then another. The blockade became a contest between strangulation and repetition. The repetition did more than keep people alive. It built trust. Berliners could watch the aircraft descend into Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel, and understand that the promise was being renewed hour by hour. The cargo was proof made physical. It could be weighed, unloaded, stacked, burned, eaten, printed, prescribed, repaired, and used. And yet the airlift's meaning did not rest only in the heavy loads. Alongside the coal and food, another kind of cargo began to capture the imagination of children watching the sky. It was small enough to hang beneath handkerchiefs, light enough to drift down from an aircraft, and powerful enough to turn a logistics campaign into a memory of kindness. The air bridge had carried survival. Soon it would also carry candy. The air bridge had carried survival in its heaviest forms: coal, flour, medicine, machinery, and fuel. But as the flights became part of Berlin's daily rhythm, the people below did not experience them only as tonnage. They heard the engines. They watched the approaches into Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel. They learned to read the sky as a kind of promise. For children especially, the aircraft were more than machines in a supply system. They were moving shapes above a divided city, arriving from beyond the blockade, with things that life still required. In a city where politics had become geography and geography had become pressure, the sight of an Allied cargo plane descending through the corridor carried a message that could be understood without speeches. Someone had come back. Someone had remembered them. That is the setting in which Lieutenant Gail Halvorson enters the story of the Berlin Airlift. Halvorson was one of the American pilots flying into Berlin during Operation Vittles. His work belonged to the same immense logistical campaign already underway. Aircraft loaded in Western Germany, routed through the agreed corridors, brought down into Berlin, unloaded quickly, and sent back again to keep the cycle moving. The airlift depended on discipline and repetition. It was designed to feed a city, warm it, and keep its basic systems alive. But Halvorson's contribution became famous for something almost weightless. He began dropping candy for Berlin children, attaching it to small parachutes made from handkerchiefs. In the scale of the airlift, these drops were tiny. They did not heat apartments. They did not power electrical stations. They did not replace the coal that made up the largest share of cargo, or the food that filled warehouses and kitchens. A piece of candy under a handkerchief parachute could not change the tonnage figures that Major General William H. Tunner's system was built to increase. And yet that was exactly why it mattered. The blockade had reduced daily life to questions of supply. How much coal could be brought in? How much food? How many flights? How much capacity? How many minutes lost on the ground? Those questions were urgent and real. But children living under the blockade also needed signs that they had not been reduced to a burden on a cargo manifest. Halverson's small parachutes gave the airlift a human scale. They turned the distant roar of engines into something personal, something a child could hold in a hand. The effort became known as Operation Little Vittles. The name itself linked the small act to the larger American operation. Operation Vittles was the formal airlift, the organized supply of West Berlin by air after the Soviet Union cut rail, road, and water access. Operation Little Vittles was its lighter companion, not a replacement for the cargo mission, but a symbol that grew out of it. It depended on the same skies, the same aircraft, and the same presence of Allied crews over Berlin. Without the airlift, there could have been no candy parachutes. Without the blockade, the parachutes would not have carried the same meaning. By January 1949, according to PBS American Experience, Operation Little Vittles had dropped about 250,000 candy parachutes. That number is striking because it shows how a spontaneous gesture became organized enough to be counted on a large scale. 250,000 small parachutes meant repeated effort. It meant candy gathered, handkerchiefs prepared, bundles tied, and drops made over a city where children had learned to look upward. In an operation dominated by tons, runway surfaces, corridors, fuel calculations, and approach procedures, this was a different kind of measure. Not tons delivered, but moments received. It is important not to sentimentalize the blockade itself. West Berlin's situation was severe. The city remained trapped inside the Soviet occupation zone, with the western sectors dependent on aircraft because surface access had been cut. Families needed food and heat. Hospitals needed medical supplies. Power systems needed coal and machinery. The airlift was first and foremost a survival operation, and it required dangerous, exhausting work from crews, ground personnel, and Berliners themselves. But history is not made only by the largest machinery. Sometimes the meaning of an event becomes clearer in the smallest object associated with it. For the Berlin Airlift, the candy parachutes became one of those objects. A handkerchief parachute carried several meanings at once. It was improvised and fragile, which made it feel close to the lives of children in a damaged city. It descended from the same airspace that was carrying food and fuel, linking kindness to the practical lifeline of the Western Allies. And it suggested that the people flying the routes were not faceless instruments of policy. They were individuals capable of noticing the children below. That mattered because the Berlin crisis was also a contest of perception. The Soviet blockade was designed to apply pressure without immediately crossing into open war. It tested whether the Western Allies would abandon their position in Berlin, or whether the population of West Berlin could be made to feel isolated enough to force a political result. The answer from the airlift was material: coal, food, medicine, fuel, machinery. But it was also psychological. Every arriving aircraft said the city was not alone. Operation Little Vittles sharpened that message. It showed that the airlift was not merely an administrative answer to a crisis. It had become a relationship between the crews and the city. The aircraft were not just entering Berlin's airspace, they were entering the imagination of its children. A cargo plane could be a machine of supply, but it could also become a symbol of care. The contrast is almost impossible to miss. On one side were the great systems, the Frankfurt, Berlin, Birkeberg, Berlin, and Hamburg, Berlin air corridors, the Berlin control zone, the radar and radio procedures, the ground crews, the heavy Douglas C-54 Skymasters, the British aircraft of Operation Plainfare, the rebuilt and newly constructed airfields. On the other side were handkerchiefs and candy. Both belonged to the same story. The handkerchief parachutes could only exist because the air bridge had become dependable. If aircraft had arrived rarely or chaotically, or as symbolic gestures rather than sustained operations, the candy drops would have been a curiosity. Instead, they unfolded within a vast rhythm of supply. The children's hope was attached to something real, a daily pattern of aircraft that continued despite the blockade. By January 1949, the airlift had moved beyond the question of whether it could function at all. The system had been hardened by discipline, expanded by new infrastructure, and strengthened by procedures that kept traffic flowing even in difficult weather. It was carrying survival goods at an immense scale. And through Operation Little Vittles, it was carrying something harder to weigh: confidence. That confidence did not end the crisis by itself. Candy could not break a blockade. But symbols can reinforce endurance, and endurance was central to the Western answer. The Soviet strategy depended on time wearing Berlin down. The airlift answered with time used differently, flight after flight, delivery after delivery, gesture after gesture. For a child in West Berlin, a candy parachute falling from the sky did not explain Allied policy, occupation disputes, currency reform, or Cold War brinkmanship. It did not need to. It said, in the simplest possible form, that the aircraft overhead were not only passing through the clouds, they were coming for them. And as winter moved toward spring, that distinction mattered. The airlift was no longer merely proving that aircraft could keep a city alive. It was proving that a disciplined supply system could become steady enough and trusted enough to carry public morale along with cargo. The same machine that made room for handkerchief parachutes would soon be tested on an even larger scale when its commanders pushed the entire air bridge toward a maximum effort and showed, in one concentrated day, how far the operation had come. By the spring of 1949, the air bridge had become more than an emergency response. It had become a public fact. Berliners heard it in the steady arrival of engines over Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel. Crews felt it in routines that had once seemed impossible and were now repeated hour after hour. The Soviet blockade had been designed to make West Berlin feel isolated, exposed, and ultimately unsustainable. But month by month, the aircraft had turned isolation into a different kind of visibility. Every landing announced that the Western Allies were still there. For Major General William H. Tunner, sentiment was not enough. Hope mattered, but hope had to be carried in cargo holds. A city could not live on symbolism, and a blockade could not be defeated by occasional success. The airlift had to show that it could deliver at a scale large enough to make Soviet pressure lose its force. It was not sufficient to keep Berlin barely alive. The operation had to prove that the city could be supplied reliably, repeatedly, and in quantities that made the blockade look less like a trap and more like a failed calculation. That was the meaning of the maximum effort operation that came to be known as the Easter Parade. On April 16, 1949, Tunner pushed the airlift toward a concentrated test of everything it had learned. The date fell during the Easter season, and the name carried a certain lightness, but the operation itself was a hard demonstration of discipline. This was not a parade in the ceremonial sense. It was a parade of aircraft, crews, controllers, mechanics, unloaders, weather teams, radio operators, and cargo handlers, all moving through a system that had been refined over months of pressure. Nearly 13,000 tons of supplies were delivered to Berlin in 24 hours. The number mattered because it was not a promise or a projection. It was measured in cargo that actually reached the city. It represented coal, food, fuel, and the other necessities that had already defined the airlift's practical purpose. It also represented something less visible: the ability to make a narrow air bridge function like an industrial supply line. The three agreed corridors into Berlin had once looked like a legal opening through a political crisis. By April, they had become the channels of a machine that could be accelerated under command. Tunner's methods had prepared the way. He had insisted on standardized procedures, fast turnaround, disciplined traffic patterns, and the elimination of wasted motion wherever possible. Aircraft did not arrive as isolated, heroic flights. They arrived as parts of a sequence. Spacing, approach control, unloading routines, maintenance checks, crew handling, and departure procedures all had to fit together. If one aircraft lingered too long, if one ground crew fell behind, if weather control or radio communication faltered, the delay could ripple outward. The Easter Parade was therefore not only a test of how much could be flown. It was a test of whether the entire airlift system could absorb pressure without losing order. The results showed how far the operation had come from its improvised beginnings. In the first days after the blockade began, the question had been whether air supply could be attempted at all. The Western Allies had chosen to fly rather than retreat from Berlin or force a ground confrontation with Soviet power. That choice avoided an immediate armed clash, but it placed a heavy burden on aircraft that were never intended to become the sole lifeline of a modern city. Early efforts depended on what was available, including smaller Douglas C-47 aircraft. Over time, the larger Douglas C-54 Skymaster became central because it could carry far more cargo, and standardization turned scattered effort into repeatable throughput. By April, that transformation was visible in a single day. The Easter Parade did not create the airlift success out of nowhere. It revealed success that had been built piece by piece. The repaired and expanded facilities at Tempelhof, the continued use of Gatow, the new capacity added by Tegel, the radar and ground-controlled approach procedures that helped aircraft operate in difficult weather, and the ground routines that kept crews near their planes while mobile canteens, weather and operations cars, and maintenance trucks met arrivals. What had once been a race against confusion had become a controlled flow. That control was the point. The Soviet blockade relied on the assumption that West Berlin's geography would eventually decide the outcome. The city sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. Rail, road, and water access had been cut. If surface routes remained closed, the western sectors would either have to accept Soviet pressure, abandon the city, or risk escalation. But the airlift changed the practical meaning of geography. The Soviet position still surrounded West Berlin on the ground, but it did not close the sky. As long as the aircraft could keep coming, the blockade could not produce the result it was designed to achieve. The Easter Parade made that contradiction impossible to ignore. A blockade is an instrument of scarcity. It works by tightening the gap between what a population needs and what can reach it. If the gap becomes unbearable, political pressure grows. But on April 16, the Western Allies demonstrated that the gap could be narrowed by air at a scale few had believed possible at the beginning of the crisis. Nearly 13,000 tons in one day did not mean that Berlin was suddenly secure forever. It meant something more specific and more damaging to Soviet strategy. The airlift was not collapsing under strain. It was improving. For Berliners, the effect was both material and psychological. The supplies that arrived that day could be weighed, unloaded, stored, burned, eaten, and distributed. But the rhythm itself also carried meaning. The city had already endured months of uncertainty, winter hardship, and political pressure. Children had watched candy parachutes drift down from aircraft. Adults had watched coal and flour arrive through a system that seemed to defy the map around them. The Easter Parade gave that experience a sharper form. It showed that the air bridge was not simply surviving from day to day. It could surge. For the crews, the operation was a confirmation of labor that had often been repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous. The airlift's drama was not always visible in a single spectacular moment. Much of it lay in routine, the same routes, the same approaches, the same cargo holds, the same rapid unloading. But routine was exactly what made the effort powerful. Tunner understood that the blockade would not be beaten by a few dramatic flights. It would be beaten by predictability. A cargo aircraft landing on schedule, unloading quickly, and departing into the pattern again was a small event. Thousands of such events became strategy. This is where the Easter Parade reached beyond logistics. It spoke to the larger political crisis without needing a formal announcement. The West did not have to claim that the blockade was failing. The tonnage said it. The Soviet Union had attempted to test whether the Western Allies would accept a divided, pressured Berlin as too costly to defend. By April 1949, the answer had been written into the air traffic over the city. The Western Allies had not forced a ground convoy through Soviet-controlled territory. They had not surrendered the city. They had built an air bridge capable of carrying the burden. The timing deepened the meaning. On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty had been signed in Washington, NAW. The Berlin crisis was still unresolved, but the outlines of a harder Cold War world were becoming clearer. The airlift was not the only cause of that transformation, yet it was one of its most visible tests. In Berlin, Allied commitment was no longer abstract. It had a sound, a schedule, and a weight. It was measured in tons delivered through narrow corridors into a city that had been meant to yield. After April 16, the blockade still existed. Soviet restrictions had not yet been lifted. Berlin still depended on the airlift, and the Western Allies still had to maintain the system they had built. But the balance of expectation had shifted. The pressure campaign had depended on the belief that time favored the blockader. The Easter parade suggested the opposite. Time had allowed the airlift to become more efficient, more coordinated, and more credible. That was the breaking point. Not a sudden collapse, not a battlefield victory, not a public surrender, but a change in what the facts on the ground and in the sky now proved. The blockade could still obstruct railways, roads, and waterways. It could still impose hardship, but it could no longer convincingly promise that West Berlin would be starved into submission while the aircraft kept coming. In the weeks that followed, diplomacy and strategy would move toward the formal end of the blockade. Yet even that end would not close the story at once. The airlift had taught the Western Allies a severe lesson. Access to Berlin could be threatened again. So when the roads and rails reopened, the cargo flights would continue for a time, building reserves against another crisis. The Easter parade had shown that the air bridge could break the pressure. The next question was, what kind of world would remain after the pressure was lifted? After the Easter parade, the blockade still existed, but its political weight had changed. The Soviet pressure on West Berlin had depended on a simple expectation that the Western Allies could not supply a modern city by air for long. By April of 1949, that expectation had been badly damaged. The aircraft were still coming. The coal was still arriving. The runways at Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel were still turning flights around in disciplined rhythm. What had begun as an emergency measure had become a working system. The formal end came on May 12, 1949. On that day, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade of West Berlin. Rail, road, and water access, cut since June 24, 1948, reopened after more than 10 months of confrontation. For Berliners, this meant the return of surface routes that had once seemed ordinary and had then become instruments of pressure. Trains and barges mattered again. Roads mattered again. The city was no longer dependent only on the narrow air corridors from Frankfurt, Buckeberg, and Hamburg. But the Western Allies did not stop flying. The airlift continued until September 30, 1949. That decision tells us something important about what the crisis had taught them. The end of the blockade was not treated as a guarantee. It was treated as a pause that had to be protected against reversal. If Soviet authorities had cut access once, they could threaten it again. So the aircraft kept moving supplies into West Berlin, not because the city was still sealed off in the same way, but because the city needed reserves. Those reserves were a form of insurance. Food could be stored. Coal could be stockpiled. Fuel, medicine, and essential materials could give West Berlin a margin of survival if the roads and rails were interrupted again. In the logic of the early Cold War, a stockpile was not just a warehouse inventory. It was a political statement. It said that the Western position in Berlin would not rest on optimism alone. The airlift had carried more than 2.3 million tons of supplies into the city. Coal had formed the largest share, about 1.5 million tons, followed by more than 500,000 tons of food. Those numbers can feel abstract, but by the end of the operation, they represented something concrete, a city that had not been forced out of the Western orbit and an alliance system that had learned to turn logistics into policy. The lifting of the blockade did not soften the Cold War. In many ways, it clarified it. During the final phase of the Berlin crisis, the Western powers had already moved toward a more formal security structure. On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington. NATO was not created only because of Berlin, but the blockade gave urgency and visible meaning to the fear behind it. The crisis had shown that post-war disputes in Europe were no longer only arguments over occupation rules, currency, or administration. They could become tests of will involving entire populations and the risk of wider conflict. Berlin had made that risk visible without turning it into open war. The United States, the United Kingdom, and their partners had resisted Soviet pressure, but they had done so by flying through agreed air corridors rather than forcing armed convoys along blocked roads. That distinction mattered. The airlift was firm, but it was also controlled. It avoided surrender, and it avoided a direct ground battle. In the emerging Cold War, that combination would become familiar. confrontation managed through limits, signals, and sustained pressure. The political map of Germany also hardened around the crisis. On May 23, 1949, only days after the blockade was lifted, the Federal Republic of Germany was established in the Western zones. This new West German state grew out of the Western occupation areas and the political decisions that had helped provoke Soviet opposition in the first place. The airlift had not created the Federal Republic by itself, but it unfolded at the same moment as the division of Germany became institutional fact. Later that year, on October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic was announced in the Soviet zone. The two German states now embodied the split that Berlin had already dramatized. Germany was no longer simply a defeated country under joint occupation, waiting for a common settlement. It had become a central front of a divided Europe. And Berlin remained the contradiction at the heart of that division. The western sectors of Berlin still sat deep inside the Soviet zone, surrounded by territory that would become part of the German Democratic Republic. The geography that had made the blockade possible did not disappear on May 12. West Berlin remained exposed. It remained dependent on access arrangements that could become contested. It remained a city where local life and world politics touched each other directly. But after the airlift, that vulnerability carried a new meaning. Before the blockade, West Berlin could appear to be a weak point, a stranded fragment of Allied authority in an impossible location. After the airlift, it became something else, a symbol of Western commitment made credible by action. That symbol had been built in unglamorous ways. It was built by cargo manifests, radar procedures, runway repairs, coal sacks, weather reports, maintenance trucks, and the discipline of crews who arrived and departed in relentless sequence. It was built by German civilians who helped expand the airfields, by controllers who kept aircraft moving through fog and darkness, by commanders who turned minutes into capacity, and by Berliners who endured the pressure without accepting Soviet domination. It was also built in public memory through smaller images: children waiting near Tempelhof, candy parachutes descending from the sky, crowds who understood that aircraft engines meant more than supply. The airlift worked because it delivered what the city needed to live. It endured in memory because it seemed to say that West Berlin had not been forgotten. That is why the end of the blockade was not a simple victory scene. There was relief, but there was no return to the older world. The crisis had taken the wartime alliance against Nazi Germany and revealed its post-war fracture. It had helped pull the Western powers into NATO. It had accompanied the birth of the Federal Republic of Germany. It had been followed by the announcement of the German Democratic Republic. It had shown that Berlin would remain one of the places where the Cold War could become dangerously real. The cargo planes did not solve the German question. They did not reunite Berlin. They did not end the rivalry between Moscow and the Western capitals. What they did was narrower, and in that narrowness lay their power. They kept a city alive long enough for pressure to fail. They proved that the Western Allies would not be pushed out of Berlin by blockade alone. They turned airspace into a lifeline and logistics into resolve. When the final airlift flights ended on September 30, 1949, the emergency machine could finally stand down. But the meaning of the machine remained. For more than a year, aircraft had crossed into Berlin carrying coal, food, medicine, machinery, newspapers, and symbols of reassurance. They had flown through weather, crowding, danger, and exhaustion. They had made the survival of West Berlin visible, one landing at a time. The blockade had been lifted. The Cold War had hardened. And in the middle of that hardening stood Berlin, damaged, divided, surrounded, and still connected to the West by the memory of engines in the sky.